Hello and welcome back to another video. Today, not only are we going to decorate these super cute gnome cookies for Valentine's Day, but I am also going to show you how I do transfers with glaze icing. Here are a few things that we are going to need. I have a food color pen from Sweet Sugar Belle and some acetate and parchment paper. And what I'm first going to do is I am using my template that I used to cut out the cookies to figure out where I need to pipe my sections. I am going to use that very same template to figure out how big my nose is going to be, because yes, I will be making a transfer for the nose. You can either pipe it directly onto the icing, but because I wanted to show you how I make my transfers, I figured I would make as many transfers as I can. And so I am piping the nose onto my parchment paper using the template underneath it. You can outline it this way first and then fill it in, but I actually find it easier if you just pipe down some icing and then use your scribe tool to bring the icing to where it needs to go. So here you see me squeezing out the icing. My icing is fairly thick. Not only will this help with the drying process, but it also helps the icing to stay in place. There's nothing worse than icing that is too loose, that will just flow everywhere and not stay in place. If you have worked with glaze icing, you know that that is always a little bit of an issue, that the icing, if it's too thin, it will just flow everywhere and not hold its shape. I also baked up some mini flowers and hearts. This one is from the Sweet Sugar Belle mini collection, and I am trying to figure out how big the middle section is going to be, so I just quickly placed the cookie underneath and kind of drawing these circles so that I can make sure they don't get too small or too big. And then I'm just using up some of my icing that I have. It really doesn't matter what color they are, as long as they stay within the color theme that you've chosen. Again, this icing is the same icing that I used before, and it just works really well. And then I covered it with some sanding sugar. This sugar was very coarse and I wasn't super thrilled about it, but that's all I had on hand. You can cover it with any kind of nonpareils or jimmies or what have you, and that will do the trick. You have to make sure that you do it right away, because the moment the icing starts to dry up, the sprinkles won't stick anymore. So instead of piping all of those circles first and then covering, I choose to do it by color and then immediately covering them with my sprinkles. Now we're gonna set those to the side, and unfortunately I thought I had filmed myself when I was making the hearts, but I couldn't find the footage. So I piped the hearts and let them dry for a little bit, maybe about half an hour. And then I went back in, and now I am piping the little fingers. And because my icing is not super thick, I have to let the middle finger there dry a little bit before I can then go in and pipe the other two next to it. If I didn't wait, it would just turn into a blob. This is the exact same icing that I used for all the other transfers, but sometimes you just have to give it a little bit of time to dry before you can move on to the next step. And again, for these hearts, I put the template of my little gnome underneath to kind of gauge how big those hearts should be. I'm gonna set those transfers to the side because they need at least a full day of drying before we can move them. And so whenever you have to do transfers, just be sure to give them enough time to dry. I usually make those first, and then I can concentrate on the cookies themselves. So as you can see, outlining the cookies first really gives me a good indication of where everything needs to go. I have tried sometimes not doing that and taking the easy route, and I always regretted it. So I really like to outline the cookies first with the marker, and then I can just go in with the icing, and I know exactly where my lines need to go. Guys, I'm super lazy when it comes to preparing my icing. The fact that I have, how many colors? 5, 6 colors is already quite a bit. So I am not making any extra consistencies. So what you see here is, I want to say, about a 30-second consistency, or maybe 25 to 30-second consistency. I never time my consistencies. I just go by feel. So apologies if this is not exactly correct, but as long as my icing doesn't immediately flow out of my bag, I am good to go. However, I will say that the white icing was just a tiny bit too thin for my liking, but I was, again, too lazy to thicken it up. As you can see, I leave the brim of the hat unfilled at the moment, and that is because I want that brim to be a little bit more separate, and for that I need to let the icing underneath or next to it crust a little bit more so that I can really fill that brim up and give it some height, and so that my cookies can end up with a little bit of texture. And that is great when you have several cookies to work on, and then you just go ahead and you continue with all the other cookies that you have to do. And by the time you're done with those, you can then go in immediately and do the rest of that brim. That usually gives it enough time for everything to crust over and not cause too many problems. The sugar pearls that I am using are from PME. The reason why I mention this is because when you plop those black sugar pearls into your icing, you want to make sure that they don't bleed. And I have found that the PME brand is really the only brand that will not bleed black into your icing. So if you want to use them for that, make sure you purchase yourself some from the PME brand. So when that's done, I can then go back to my first cookie and apply icing to the brim section. And you can see I'm really filling that section up quite a bit, and that is because I also want to make sure that those eyeballs kind of disappear underneath that brim a little bit. I want that little guy to kind of peek out from underneath. Using those black pearls is really a great way if you don't want to make extra black icing. So keep that in mind for next time when you need eyeballs. Next, I am outlining my flower cookies, and the reason why I do that is because I want the outline and the inside of the cookie to be a different color, and for that outline to really stand out a little bit more on its own. So I'm outlining all of them, and then I'm gonna set them aside. I ended up letting them dry for a little bit too long, and what happened was after the whole cookie had a chance to dry, the icing kind of was dipping a little bit and didn't dry as puffy as I would have liked. But I will show and point it out to you once we get to it. I did the same to the hearts, and then it was time to give the gnome hat a little bit more definition. In the end, I kind of wished I hadn't outlined the brim the way I did. I actually didn't quite like it as much, but it is what it is. It's just a cookie. Alright, after many hours later, I came back and I filled all the flowers, and they looked so pretty. And then when I let them dry overnight, I came back to them with dips in them. You can't win all the time, so it was okay because I really only made those cookies for this video. They're not going to anyone, so I didn't really mind. But just keep that in mind. You can achieve that same look without letting your outline dry for as long as I did here. As long as it has crusted over enough, it will be okay. The reason why you should avoid letting your outlines dry for too long is because that outline will then suck up all the new moisture from the fresh icing, and that's what creates those dips and dimples. This is the next day. In the morning, I made those about I want to say 24 hours ago, and I am checking to see if they will release from the paper, and they're still stuck to it. And so I have to let them sit for a little bit longer. I ended up doing all of this in the evening, and it was just fine. So about 36 hours in total. These noses would have been fine because it wasn't as big as the flower center, but I ended up waiting for all of it until the evening. So just about 36 hours in total. I decided I wanted to color my noses in different shades of brown, and so by using a very light base I am able to then give my noses different shades. So here, this is me again in the evening, like I said, trying to release my flower centers, and you can see they were still sticking a little bit, but they did come off much easier. They weren't completely dry, but dry enough so I could take them off the paper and handle them. The same for those noses, they popped off much easier even. I had to be a little bit more careful with the hearts because of the shape that they have. Also, this one I ended up sticking a little bit and broke. So that's why it's always good to make more transfers than you really need, because you just never know if they're gonna break on you or not. So always make more than what you need. And I'm going to do the same with the little hands that I did with the noses. I will give them different shades of brown. You can see some of these release really well, others have a little bit of a harder time. Breakage happens, guys, so just make sure you have plenty of transfers available. It's always better to have more than not enough. So now we're going to move back to the flowers, and as you can see, the dips, those little divots that created, I don't mind it too much. I think it gives the flower a nice little shape, that petal, but yeah, in order to avoid that, you definitely don't want to let the outline dry for too long. So I'm trying out the different centers just to see what works best, and then I just use a little bit of icing to glue them on to the flowers. I wanted to give my gnomes a little bit more texture, and I am using food markers here and some alcohol. I don't like using water because it tends to dissolve the icing and then it gets sticky, and because alcohol evaporates a lot faster than water, I don't tend to have that problem. So here I'm using the food color markers, but you can also use just regular food color. That's totally fine. And then I mark where my shadows go, and just with a slightly damp brush I will then disperse that food color and give my hat and the rest of the gnome a little bit of shading. This is totally extra, and of course you don't have to do that, but I just like to give it a little bit more of a 3D effect. I'm also using black underneath the brim to give it a little bit more of a shadow there. And then underneath the hat for the body, I also darkened a little bit more. Play around with it and see what looks best. Mine, I wanted to have a little bit more of a shabby look, and so I really like how that turned out. And again, the same goes for the shoes. Instead of making yet another color, I just decided to color the shoes black, and that allowed me to make the shoes different colors if I even wanted to. So sometimes when you're lazy, you just color over your icing, and that works just as well. The same with the beard. I gave the beard a little bit of black there, and also just a little bit of blue, and this blue was very dark, and so instead of drawing it onto the cookie, I just dabbed the tip of my brush and added just ever so slightly a little bit of blue in, and then I blended it all in, and that allowed for the beard to not be so one-dimensional. I could have also piped a little bit more white on top. I could have dabbed some more white icing to make it look a little bit fluffy. There's lots of different ways you can elevate your cookie design instead of just leaving it flat. That looks good. And then I added a little bit of a patch on his hat. I'm gonna have to let that dry before I can paint on the stitches. I should have done that earlier, but I forgot. It was an add-on that I didn't think of until I finished that part. I was like, oh, let's add that, but I did end up having to wait for it to dry completely. So I just stuck on the nose there, again just with some icing. Now that those transfers are completely dry, they work really well. The good thing about making transfers ahead of time is so that you don't have to worry about drying time. Like I said before, if your bottom icing is too dry, if you add icing on top, then that bottom layer wants to suck the moisture out from the top layer, which will give you these dips and holes that are unsightly. And so that's just one way to avoid these issues. Sometimes I see that people have trouble with their transfers. The color seems to get all wonky and it seems to look crystallized. I never really have that problem, and I think one of the reasons why I don't have this problem is because my icing is on the thicker side, and also I have plenty of white food color in my base, and so whenever I add any extra color to my icing and I then let it dry, I never seem to have crystallization or discoloration of any kind. So these are just a few things to be aware of. Lots of newbies, they don't really know exactly how much white food coloring needs to go into the base, and then they end up with all sorts of issues. So as you can see, none of my transfers had any discoloration, anything, and that is because my icing is thick and it has enough white food color. And as I mentioned, you can keep your transfers for a very long time. I made these last spring and I stored them in a cool, dry place, and I now can use them. And I had quite a bit left over, and so I decided why not use them up on my gnome cookies, and it turned out to be such a cute little touch. I added them to the hat and also to the hearts, and they tied in nicely. I just love how they turned out. They're so cute. And here is the whole set. Aren't they just so adorable? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more of Glaze Icing content, consider subscribing. It costs nothing and it helps me grow my channel. I work exclusively with glaze icing and modified glaze, and so if that's what you would like to learn more about, come join us. We're having a good time over here. Until next time.